Quote, "It didn't begin with a speech or a ceremony but with a quiet final promise made in the fading hours of a man who had seen everything." Behind the guarded doors of a royal residence, Prince Philip spoke words that would linger long after his passing. And when those words reached King Charles III, the reaction was something no one expected: silence, followed by tears. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded in those final days was not the carefully managed farewell the world believed it to be, but something far more intimate, far more consequential. Access to Philip had been restricted with unusual precision, visits timed, conversations limited, and every moment monitored by a circle so tight that even seasoned palace aides found themselves kept at a distance. It was within this controlled quiet that a single meeting stood apart, a private exchange between a father who had spent a lifetime defending an institution and a son now destined to carry its full burden. Those familiar with the inner workings of the palace would later suggest that the tone of that meeting was unlike anything previously witnessed, not nostalgic, not reflective, but urgent, as though time itself was running out and something essential had yet to be secured. In the days that followed, subtle but unmistakable shifts began to surface. King Charles III, long accustomed to public composure, appeared withdrawn in ways that insiders struggled to explain. Conversations were cut short, engagements approached with an unusual heaviness, and moments of silence lingered where words were expected. Those closest to him noticed at first the hesitation before speaking, the weight behind his gaze, the sense that something unseen had settled onto his shoulders. It wasn't grief alone. Grief, after all, was expected. This felt different, deeper, as if he had been entrusted with something he could neither share nor can ignore. Meanwhile, within the palace corridors, whispers began to form. Not loud enough to be acknowledged, not clear enough to be confirmed, but persistent. A final instruction, some called it. Others described it as a burden, something passed not through ceremony but through trust. And yet, no official word ever followed. No statement clarified what had transpired, no acknowledgement hinted at its significance. Instead, silence became the chosen response, a silence so deliberate it only can deepen the mystery. What made it more unsettling was the pattern that followed. Reports quiet at first, then impossible to dismiss, suggested that those final days had not been as peaceful as presented, not in the conventional sense. There had been urgency, moments of intensity, conversations that carried more weight than anyone expected. Aides who had served for decades began to recall small details that, at the time, seemed insignificant: the extended duration of that final meeting, the closed doors, the absence of interruptions that normally defined royal protocol. It was as though the usual rules had been suspended, even if only briefly, to allow something critical to pass from one generation to the next, and at the center of it all was that promise. Not spoken publicly, not recorded, but felt. Then came the reaction that no one could ignore. In the immediate aftermath of Philip's passing, those who observed King Charles III closely noted a moment brief, but undeniable, where composure gave way. It wasn't a public display, not something captured for headlines, but something witnessed by those within reach. A pause that stretched too long, a breath that faltered, a silence that carried more meaning than words ever could. For a man trained to embody stability, to represent continuity, that moment spoke volumes. It suggested that whatever had been said in that final conversation had not only been heard but accepted. And acceptance, in this context, came with consequences. As days turned into weeks, the whispers refused to fade. Instead, they evolved. Media insiders, those accustomed to separating speculation from truth, began to acknowledge that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to directly, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. Decisions carried a different tone, priorities seemed to realign, and within those changes, the outline of that final promise began to take shape, not as a clear directive, but as an can influence, guiding choices from the shadows. The palace, for its part, maintained its silence, neither confirming nor denying, allowing the narrative to drift without anchor. But in that silence, the story only grew stronger, more compelling, more difficult to ignore. Because what started as a hushed conversation had become something far larger, something that extended beyond personal grief into the realm of responsibility, legacy, and power. And those who understood the weight of the crown began to realize that this was not simply about what had been said, but about what it meant. About the decisions it would shape, the paths it would force, the tensions it might ignite. The promise, whatever its exact form, had already begun to move through the system, influencing quietly, but decisively. And for King Charles III, there was no turning away from it. No retreat, only the slow, inevitable process of carrying it forward. But that promise wasn't just emotional, it carried a weight tied to duty, legacy, and a decision that would reshape the future of the crown. What if the last words from a father weren't comforting but cautionary? Those close to the late Prince Philip suggest his final message to King Charles III wasn't about grief, it was about survival, a warning, a line that could not be crossed. And as the echoes of that moment lingered, the deeper meaning behind it began to press forward, quietly but relentlessly, reshaping everything that had once seemed stable. Because, this was not a man known for vague sentiment or empty reflection. Philip had spent decades standing at the very edge of the monarchy's inner machinery, watching it bend, strain, and at times nearly fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. He understood something few ever truly grasped, that the crown was not sustained by tradition alone, but by discipline, restraint, and a willingness to sacrifice personal desire for institutional survival. Reports whispered cautiously among those. Khan, who had long observed the royal structure, began to suggest that Philip's final message carried a sharp clarity, almost surgical in its intent. It was not about mourning what had passed, but about preventing what could come next. There had been concerns, long before his final days, that the balance within the royal family was beginning to tilt in dangerous ways. Subtle tensions barely visible to the public had been growing beneath the surface. Differences in vision, in loyalty, in how the future of the monarchy should be shaped. And Philip, with his unfiltered understanding of power and consequence, had seen it all unfolding long before anyone else dared to acknowledge it. For King Charles III, this placed him in an impossible position. He was not simply a son grieving a father, he was a monarch being handed a directive that demanded action. A directive rooted not in emotion, but in duty. And that distinction mattered, because where Philip had always chosen the institution over the individual, Charles had often been seen as someone caught between the two, torn between personal relationships and the rigid expectations of the crown. Now, those two worlds were colliding in a way that left no room for hesitation. The warning, whatever its exact form, carried an implication that could not be ignored. That failure to act might not just weaken the monarchy, it could unravel it. And so the weight of that final promise began to take on a sharper edge. It was no longer just something. Remembered, it was something that demanded fulfillment. Insiders would later suggest that Philip's concern had centered on the idea of internal instability, not an external threat. Not public criticism, but something far more dangerous. A slow erosion from within. The kind that begins quietly, almost invisibly, until it reaches a point where recovery becomes nearly impossible. That fear, that awareness, had shaped everything Philip stood for. And in his final moments, it appeared he had passed. That awareness directly to his son. What made it even more unsettling was the realization that this was not a theoretical warning. It was immediate, urgent, the kind of message that forces decisions to be made quickly, decisively, and without the comfort of consensus. King Charles III now faced a choice that extended far beyond personal loyalty. To honor his father's words meant confronting realities that others might prefer to ignore. It meant acknowledging tensions that had been carefully, managed, differences that had been quietly tolerated, and risks that had been left unspoken. And once acknowledged, those realities could not be undone. The contrast was stark. On one side stood the expectations of a father who had dedicated his life to protecting the monarchy's structure at any cost. On the other stood a son who had spent years navigating the delicate balance between tradition and change, between preserving the past and adapting to the future. Now, those two forces were no longer in harmony, they were in conflict. And the promise, whatever its full scope, had become the point where that conflict would be resolved, not gradually, not comfortably, but with consequences that would ripple through every level of the royal family. because this was never just about what was said in that final conversation. It was about what those words demanded moving forward, about the choices they would force, the alliances they would strain, and the lines they would draw, lines that, quote, once crossed, could never be redrawn. And as those implications began to surface, quietly but unmistakably, it became clear that the monarchy was entering a moment of transformation, one shaped not by public events, but by a private exchange that refused to remain contained. And as the meaning behind those words began to surface, it became clear this wasn't just about father and son, it was about power. Long before the world noticed cracks, those inside the palace had already felt them. Behind, in polished appearances, tensions were quietly escalating, and King Charles III knew it. What appeared to the public as continuity and calm had for some time been masking a slow and deliberate shift beneath the surface. Not chaos, not open conflict, but something far more dangerous. A quiet divergence, a growing distance in thought, in approach, in vision. It wasn't spoken about openly, not in ways that could be traced or confirmed, but it existed in the pauses between conversations, in the careful, quote, wording of statements, in the subtle recalibration of roles that only those paying close attention could detect. And for Charles, who had spent decades preparing to inherit not just a crown but a system, that shift was impossible to ignore. Within the inner circles, where decisions were shaped long before they reached the public eye, the divisions had begun to take form. Senior members of the royal family, once aligned by duty and shared purpose, were now navigating a landscape that felt increasingly uncertain. There were differences measured at first, almost imperceptible, but growing. Differences in how the monarchy should adapt, how it should present itself, how it should survive in a world that no longer responded to it in the same way. At the center of that divergence stood Prince William, whose approach carried a different tone, more direct, more responsive to the pressures of a changing public, more willing to consider adjustments that previous generations might have, quote, resisted. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't defiance, but it was change. And change, within an institution built on continuity, always carries risk. For King Charles III, this created a tension that could not be easily resolved. He understood the need for evolution. He had, in many ways, advocated for it long before ascending the throne. Yet he also understood the cost of moving too quickly, of allowing the foundations of the monarchy to shift without careful control. And now, as those differing perspectives became more defined, he found himself standing at the intersection of two competing realities, one rooted in preservation, the other in adaptation, both necessary, both dangerous, and neither capable of existing without the other. It was in this environment that the memory of Prince Philip took on a new significance, because Philip had not simply observed these fractures, he had anticipated them. In his final months, those closest to him would later suggest there had been a heightened awareness, a sharpened focus on the internal dynamics of the royal family, not in a reactive sense, but in a strategic one, as though he understood that the greatest threat was not external pressure, but internal misalignment. A system that could not agree on its own direction could not sustain itself. And that realization, carried into his final days, seemed to shape the urgency of his final words. The idea that something needed to be corrected began to move quietly through the palace, not as an official directive, but as an unspoken understanding. It was not about assigning blame or identifying fault. It was about recognizing that the current trajectory, if left unchecked, could lead to a gradual weakening of the institution itself. And for Charles, that recognition came with a weight that extended beyond personal preference or leadership style. It became a question of responsibility, of whether he could reconcile the legacy he had inherited with the realities he now, quote, faced. What made this moment particularly volatile was the absence of clear resolution. There was no single path forward, no obvious answer that could satisfy both tradition and necessity. Every choice carried consequences. Every decision risked deepening the very divisions it sought to address. And within that uncertainty, the pressure began to build, not publicly, not visibly, but steadily. The kind of pressure that shapes outcomes long before they are announced. The kind that forces a leader to act, even when action itself carries risk. Because this was no longer a matter of observation. It was a moment that demanded intervention. a moment where hesitation could allow those fractures to widen beyond repair. And for King Charles III, the challenge was not simply to understand the problem but to decide how far he was willing to go to resolve it. The legacy he carried demanded stability. The reality he faced demanded change. And somewhere between those two forces lay the decision that, quote, would define not only his reign but the future of the monarchy itself. But what Philip had asked, what he had insisted, would force Charles into a position no monarch wants to face. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even advice. What Prince Philip left behind was a promise, one that King Charles III could neither ignore nor escape. It arrived without ceremony, without documentation, without the usual machinery that defines royal decisions, and yet it carried a force stronger than any official decree. Because this promise was not bound by protocol, it was bound by expectation, a final act of trust from a man who had spent a lifetime understanding exactly how fragile the monarchy could become when discipline gave way to uncertainty. And now, that understanding had been transferred, quietly but irrevocably, into the hands of a king who could feel its weight with every decision he made. At its core, the promise appeared to revolve around something fundamental, safeguarding the very structure of the monarchy itself. Not in a symbolic sense, not as a vague ideal, but as a practical necessity. Those who had studied Philip's approach over decades knew that he did not deal in abstractions. He believed in systems, in boundaries, in the clear definition of roles and responsibilities. And if his final words carried that same clarity, then what he had asked of Charles was not optional. It was essential. Because a monarchy without structure is not a monarchy at all, it is a family, exposed to the pressures of the modern world, vulnerable to influence, division, and eventual decline. For King Charles III, the implications were immediate and deeply personal. To honor the promise meant more than quiet acknowledgement, it meant action. Action that could affect those closest to him. Action that could redefine relationships that had been carefully maintained over years. And perhaps most difficult of all, action that could create friction within a family already navigating subtle, but undeniable tensions. Because safeguarding the institution often requires decisions that do not align with personal comfort. It demands clarity where ambiguity once existed. It forces boundaries where flexibility had been allowed. And Charles, who had long balanced between tradition and empathy, now found himself being pulled firmly toward one side. The emotional cost of that shift was impossible to ignore. Reports from within the palace suggested that his tone had begun to change, not dramatically. Not in a way that could be easily quoted or confirmed, but in a manner that those around him could feel. Conversations became more direct. Decisions carried less hesitation. There was a growing sense that something had settled into place, that the internal debate had reached its conclusion. And while the public continued to see a monarch fulfilling his duties with measured composure, those within his immediate circle recognized a deeper transformation. This was not simply a man adjusting to his role. This was a man responding to something he had been entrusted with, something he had chosen to carry forward despite the consequences it might bring. Senior aides, many of whom had served through multiple reigns, began to notice patterns that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Priorities were shifting. Certain discussions were approached with renewed urgency. Decisions that once might have been delayed were now being resolved with quiet efficiency. It was as though the, quote, promise had introduced a new framework, an unseen guide shaping the direction of the monarchy from within. And yet, because it had never been publicly acknowledged, its influence remained difficult to define. It existed in the space between intention and action, visible only to those close enough to observe its effects. What made this moment particularly powerful was the contrast it created. On one hand, there was the image of continuity, a monarchy moving forward, maintaining its presence, and fulfilling its role. On the other, there was the reality of transformation, subtle, deliberate, and driven by a private commitment that had begun to reshape everything from the inside out. Success and stability on the surface, struggle and recalibration beneath it. And at the center of that contrast stood King Charles III, navigating a path that required him to honor both his father's legacy and his own understanding of what the future demanded. Because this promise was not something that can be fulfilled in a single moment. It was not a decision that could be announced and completed. It was a process, a series of choices, each building on the last, each carrying the potential to shift the balance within the royal family. And as those choices began to unfold, quietly but unmistakably, it became clear that the impact of that final conversation was already extending far beyond the walls in which it had taken place. The monarchy was not standing still. It was adjusting, realigning, and preparing for something that had yet to fully reveal itself. And as Charles began to act, those closest to him started to realize the promise was already being fulfilled. Kings are not supposed to break. Not in public, not in private. But sources suggest that when the full weight of that promise settled in, King Charles III did something no one had seen before he broke down. It wasn't a spectacle, not a moment meant for cameras or even for wider awareness. It was quiet, contained, and yet deeply revealing. Because for a figure defined by composure, by restraint, by the unspoken rule that emotion must always remain behind closed doors, this shift carried meaning far beyond the moment itself. It signaled something had changed, not just in circumstance, but within him. The promise left behind by Prince Philip was no longer an abstract responsibility. It had become personal, immediate, and impossible to separate from his own sense of identity. In the days that followed, those closest to him began to notice a pattern that could not be dismissed as simple grief. There were moments, brief, fleeting, where the weight of expectation seemed to press through the carefully maintained exterior. Conversations would slow, pauses would stretch, and a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for leadership now appeared to be grappling with something far more complex than duty alone. Reports emerging from within the palace suggested that these emotional shifts were not isolated. They were recurring, subtle reminders that beneath the structure of the crown stood an individual being asked to carry more than any single role should demand. The balance between duty and personal loss became increasingly fragile. On one side was the expectation to remain steady, to project continuity, to embody the very stability the monarchy depends upon. On the other side was the reality of what had been lost: a father, a mentor, a figure whose presence had long provided both guidance and grounding. But this was not a loss that allowed for retreat. It demanded progression. And that progression came with the added weight of a promise that transformed grief into obligation. Because to mourn privately while acting publicly is one challenge. To do so while reshaping the future of an institution is another entirely. It was within this tension that conversations with Queen Camilla reportedly began to reflect a different tone. Not conflict, not overt disagreement, but a quiet strain and an acknowledgement that the path ahead was no longer defined solely by personal understanding, but by something external, something inherited. The decisions being considered were no longer just about present circumstances. They were about fulfilling a directive that carried consequences neither of them could fully control. And in those conversations, according to those familiar with the atmosphere, there was a growing awareness that whatever choices lay ahead would not come without cost. Because, quote, that was the reality beginning to take shape. The promise was not without consequence. It demanded clarity in areas where ambiguity had once provided comfort. It required action where hesitation had once been possible. And most of all, it forced a confrontation not just with the expectations of Prince Philip, but with the limits of what King Charles III himself was prepared to endure. A monarch is expected to lead, to decide, to carry forward. But rarely is that expectation paired so directly, quote, with such a deeply personal burden. And as that burden settled in, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Strength on the surface, struggle beneath it. What emerged in those moments was something rarely associated with the Kruna glimpse of vulnerability that did not weaken the role, but redefined it. Because the ability to confront such weight, to continue despite it, to act not in spite of emotion but through it, revealed a different kind of resilience, one not built solely on tradition, but on endurance. And yet, even as that resilience took shape, the cost remained evident. The emotional toll did not disappear. It lingered, shaping decisions, influencing interactions, reminding those close enough to see that this was not a transition without consequence. And still, the process continued. The promise moved forward, carried not by ceremony but by necessity. Each decision, each shift in tone, each subtle change in direction reflected its growing influence. The monarchy, from the outside, remained intact. But within, something deeper was unfolding, a recalibration driven by a private commitment that had begun to reshape everything it touched. And for King Charles III, there was no longer any separation between the role he held and the burden he carried. They had become one and the same. But emotion alone couldn't change what had already been set in motion, and the consequences were beginning to ripple outward. What began as a private promise soon became a silent force, reshaping the entire royal family. And not everyone was prepared for what came next. What had once existed as a contained, deeply personal exchange between Prince Philip and King Charles III was no longer confined to memory. It had begun to move outward, quietly altering the balance within the monarchy itself. There were no public declarations, no dramatic announcements to signal change. Instead, the transformation unfolded in subtle shifts, in decisions that seemed ordinary on the surface, but can carry deeper intent beneath. Roles were reconsidered, responsibilities began to realign, and within those adjustments, the unmistakable presence of that final promise could be felt guiding the direction forward. At the center of this evolving landscape stood Prince William, whose role began to take on a new intensity. Not abruptly, not in a way that would disrupt the appearance of continuity, but with a quiet confidence that suggested something had changed behind the scenes. His involvement deepened. His influence became more defined, and with that came a shift in how decisions were approached, how priorities were set, how the future of the monarchy was being shaped in real time. It wasn't about stepping beyond his position, it was about stepping fully into it. And for those observing closely, it became clear that this was not simply evolution, it was alignment. But alignment, within a structure as complex as the royal family, rarely occurs without consequence. As certain figures moved closer to the center of decision-making, others seemed to drift toward the edges, not dramatically, not in ways that could be openly acknowledged, but enough to create a sense of repositioning that did not go unnoticed. It wasn't exclusion, it wasn't confrontation, it was something quieter, more controlled. A recalibration of presence, of influence, of where each individual stood within the broader framework of the institution. And while the public continued to see unity, those familiar with the inner workings understood that unity was being carefully managed, not naturally sustained. This tension began to surface in subtle ways during public appearances. Moments that once carried an effortless cohesion now held a different kind of energy, still composed, still measured, but with an undercurrent that hinted at something more complex beneath the surface. Interactions were precise, movements deliberate, expressions controlled. Everything remained within the boundaries of an expectation, yet there was an awareness difficult to define, but impossible to ignore, that something had shifted. That behind the carefully maintained image of continuity, a process of adjustment was quietly unfolding, and through it all, the monarchy itself was adapting, not loudly, not in a way that would invite scrutiny, but deliberately, with a sense of purpose that suggested these changes were not reactive, but intentional. The promise had introduced a new framework, one that required clarity, structure, and a willingness to make decisions that might not have been considered before. It was no longer about maintaining what existed. It was about ensuring that what remained could endure, and that meant confronting realities that had once been left unspoken. What made this transformation particularly striking was how far its influence began to reach. The promise, though rooted in a private moment, was now shaping outcomes that extended well beyond its original context. It was affecting how roles were defined, how authority was exercised, how the monarchy presented itself both internally and externally. It had become a guiding force, unseen but unmistakable. And as that influence expanded, so too did the realization that this was not a temporary adjustment. It was a turning point. Because beneath every shift, every decision, every carefully measured change, there remained a question that had yet to be fully answered. A question tied not just to what Prince Philip had said, but to why he had said it. What had he seen in those final days that required such urgency? What future had he been trying to shape, or perhaps prevent? And as the effects of that promise continued to ripple through the royal family, quietly but decisively, it became clear that the answers to those questions were still unfolding. Yet the deeper truth behind Philip's final words still lingered, raising one unsettling question. Why would a man like Prince Philip leave behind such a heavy, final message? What did he see that others didn't? To understand the weight of that question, one has to look beyond the final days and into the decades that shaped him, a lifetime spent not at the center of the crown, but just beside it. Close enough to witness every fracture, every near collapse, every moment when the institution teetered on the edge of something irreversible. Philip was never simply an observer. He was a strategist, a stabilizer, someone who understood that the monarchy cannot endure by chance, but by constant vigilance. And over time, that vigilance had sharpened into something almost instinctive, an ability to sense when the balance was shifting, when unseen pressures were beginning to build. Those who studied his role closely often pointed to his reputation for blunt honesty. He was not known for softening his views or disguising his concerns. When something required attention, he addressed it directly, sometimes uncomfortably so. But behind that directness was a deeper quality: foresight, the ability to look beyond the present moment and anticipate what might come next. And if his final message carried that same clarity, then it was not simply a reflection on what had been. It was a projection of what could be, a warning rooted not in speculation but in experience. Because Philip had seen what happens when the monarchy loses its footing. He had witnessed the strain of public scrutiny, the impact of internal division, the consequences of decisions made, too late or not at all. It is within that context that his final promise begins to take on a more complex meaning, not just as a personal request, but as a calculated safeguard, something designed not for immediate effect, but for long-term stability. The idea that he may have been preparing for a future others had not yet fully grasped is what gives that promise its unsettling edge. Because if Philip believed the monarchy was approaching a critical point, one where its survival could no longer be taken for granted, then his actions in those final moments were not just symbolic, they were strategic. A final attempt to influence the direction of an institution he had spent his life protecting. For King Charles III, this realization carries a different kind of weight. It transforms the promise from something emotional into something far more deliberate. A message that was not meant to comfort, but to prepare. And preparation, in this case, requires more than reflection. It requires action. Action guided by an understanding that the challenges ahead may not be visible yet, but are already in motion. That the fractures Philip had sensed were not temporary, but part of a larger shift that would demand careful navigation. What makes this even more compelling is the sense that not everything about that message has been fully revealed, or perhaps even fully understood. There remains a deeper layer, something just beyond reach, hinted at but never clearly defined. Those familiar, with the inner workings of the royal family have suggested that Philip often operated with an awareness that extended beyond immediate circumstances, that he was capable of seeing patterns others missed. And if that was true, then his final words may have carried implications that are only now beginning to surface. Not all at once, but gradually, unfolding over time. Because the most unsettling possibility is not that Philip left behind a warning, but that the warning is still unfolding. That the events now taking shape, the shifts being observed, the tensions being managed, are all part of a trajectory he had already anticipated. And if that is the case, then the promise he left behind is not just guiding the present, it is shaping the future. A future that remains uncertain, not because it lacks direction, but because its full meaning has yet to be revealed. And as time moves forward, one thing becomes impossible to ignore: the promise didn't end with Philip. In the end, it was never just about a promise, it was about legacy. A final act of guidance from a man who understood the crown better than most, passed to a son now carrying its full weight. What Prince Philip left behind was not something that could be placed in archives or summarized in statements. It was something far more enduring, a living directive, a quiet force shaping decisions in ways the public would never fully see, yet powerful enough to influence the course of the monarchy itself. And for King Charles III, that meant every step forward was no longer just his own, it was guided, measured, and, in many ways, defined by that final exchange. As time moved forward, it became increasingly clear that this was not a temporary phase of reflection. It was a sustained shift. Decisions carried a new tone, firm, deliberate, and anchored in a sense of responsibility that extended beyond the present moment. The monarchy, long shaped by tradition, was now evolving under a direction that felt both subtle and unyielding. There were no sweeping declarations, no abrupt transformations. Instead, there was consistency, a quiet reinforcement of structure, a steady commitment to ensuring that the institution remained intact, even as the world around it continued to change. And within that consistency, the influence of Philip's final words could still be felt, guiding from beneath the surface. For King Charles III, this meant navigating a path that required constant balance. Each decision carried weight, not just for its immediate impact, but for what it represented in the broader context of legacy. There was no room for hesitation, yet no decision could be made without careful consideration. Because the promise he carried was not simply about maintaining stability, it was about ensuring continuity, about preserving something that had existed for generations, even as it faced pressures that no previous era had fully encountered. And in doing so, Charles was not just acting as a monarch. He was fulfilling a role that demanded both strength and sacrifice. What makes this legacy so powerful is how it continues to exist not in memory, but in action. Prince Philip is no longer present, yet his influence remains unmistakable. It is present in the choices being made, in the priorities being set, in the quiet but deliberate direction the monarchy is taking. This is not remembrance. This is continuation. A legacy that does not rely on ceremony but on execution. And through that execution, the, quote, values Philip upheld discipline, structure, unwavering commitment continue to shape the institution he helped protect for so many years. But beneath that sense of continuity lies an undeniable truth: the emotional cost has not disappeared. Duty, in its purest form, often demands more than it gives. And for King Charles III, the burden of carrying forward that promise has required confronting limits, making difficult choices, and accepting consequences that cannot always be avoided. The crown can endure, but the path to that endurance is rarely without strain. It requires resilience not just in public, but in private. It demands a willingness to place the institution above personal comfort, even when that choice carries its own weight. And yet, despite that cost, the crown remains. Not unchanged, not untouched, but intact. Stronger in some ways, more aware in others, shaped by the very challenges it has been forced to confront. Because evolution does not weaken the monarchy, it tests it. It reveals where it can bend and where it must stand firm. And through that process, the influence of that final promise becomes even more apparent. It was never about preserving the past exactly as it was. It was about ensuring that the future could still exist. Because in the House of Windsor, promises are never just words, they are the invisible threads that hold the crown together or quietly pull it apart. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.